Hi, my name is Daniel Mercer. For years, I thought I could keep my distance from my ex-wife's fortune, $40 million I never wanted to fight over. But when my own daughter looked me in the eye and swore I'd never see a single cent, it stopped being about money and became about something much bigger: respect, truth, and the right to stand my ground. I had always believed that stepping down from the CEO role at Hale Foods was the right move. After decades of building the company from a small organic produce supplier into a national brand, I thought my successor, my niece by adoption, Emily Hale, would carry the torch. She was young, energetic, and I thought grateful. But 6 months after her promotion, my instincts told me something was wrong. Reports were arriving late. Numbers didn't add up. Trusted managers I'd worked with for decades were retiring or moving on without a word to me. The warmth in the company's culture had cooled. And Emily, she no longer called me Uncle Bob. It was just Bob, clipped and formal. The first crack in the facade came on a rainy Thursday evening. Helen, my executive assistant of 15 years, appeared at my home, unannounced, clutching a flash drive and looking over her shoulder as though she'd been followed. "Bob," she said, voice low, "I think you need to see this." I led her inside, poured her a cup of coffee, and sat at my desk. When I plugged in the drive, my heart sank. Spreadsheets, email chains, and scanned contracts, all pointing to a shell company named Orion Supplies. Payments in the hundreds of thousands funneled through Orion every month. The signatures were Emily's and Clara Mitchell's, our CFO. "Orion doesn't exist," Bob Helen said, eyes fixed on mine. "It's a front. They're bleeding the company dry." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. Anger wasn't my first reaction. Betrayal was. I had raised Emily as if she were my own, guided her through school, supported her ambitions. Now she was carving up the company my father and I had built piece by piece. I leaned back, folded my hands, and let out a slow breath. If they think I'm just going to sit and watch, they're in for a surprise. I knew this couldn't be handled impulsively. The board wouldn't act on suspicion alone. Emily and Clara were smart. They would cover their tracks the second they felt cornered. If I moved too soon, I'd lose everything. I needed a plan. That night, I made 3 calls. The first was to James Carter, a corporate lawyer I trusted with my life. The second was to Victor Lane, a former Hale Foods communications director turned investigative journalist. The third back to Helen to let her know she'd just been drafted into something much bigger than she realized. By midnight, we had the skeleton of a strategy. Helen would remain inside, quietly gathering every shred of evidence: emails, contracts, transaction records. James would prepare a legal case airtight enough to withstand the most expensive defense team money could buy. Victor would start pulling threads in the media, learning who else Emily and Clara might be connected to. I knew this wasn't going to be a quick fight. It would take weeks, maybe months of patience, precision, and absolute secrecy. One mistake, and they'd bury everything. As I looked out my study window at the rain streaking down the glass, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: the quiet hum of a game beginning. And if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's this: winning isn't about playing the loudest. It's about making the move they never see coming. My phone buzzed on the desk, a message from an unknown number. "We know you've been asking questions. Stop now." I stared at it for a moment, then smiled. The game was on. I didn't reply to the text. The worst thing you can do when an enemy shows their hand is to let them know you've seen it. Instead, I locked the phone, slid it into my desk drawer, and opened my leather-bound notebook. This was where every war began for me, not on a screen, but on paper. Step 1 was information. Helen called the next morning from the company parking lot, speaking in the careful, clipped voice of someone who knew they might be overheard. "They're planning a procurement meeting this Friday with Orion," she said. "It's off the books. Clara told the team not to log it in the calendar." "Good," I said. "Keep acting like you don't know I'm watching." And Helen emailed me, "Nothing. Everything goes through the Dropbox." The Dropbox wasn't digital. It was an actual lockbox inside a defunct storage room in one of our distribution centers. Helen had the only key besides me. No digital trail, no risk of interception. By Wednesday, the box held a thick manila envelope. Inside were copies of invoices that made my stomach turn: inflated prices, vague product descriptions, duplicate orders. Money was moving in circles designed to confuse any casual audit. But to my eyes, it was an old trick, one I'd seen taken down before. I slid the papers into a separate folder labeled Phase 1 and called James Carter. They're getting sloppy, I told him. I've got hard copies. Sloppy is good, James replied. But we need more than sloppy. We need a smoking gun, something that proves intent, not just incompetence. That was where Victor came in. He'd been quietly poking around the logistics sector, using his old contacts to trace Orion supplies. On Thursday, he called me with a lead. Orion's registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, he said. No physical address, no staff. But here's the kicker, it's tied to another LLC in Nevada. Guess who the listed director is? Tell me, Clara's husband. It was the thread I'd been hoping for. Shell companies don't operate alone. They exist in chains, each link hiding the next. And if one link connected directly to a known insider, that was leverage, maybe even enough to make one of them flip. Still, I didn't rush. The more time they had to think they were safe, the deeper they'd sink. Every week they siphoned more money, every week they dug their own hole. On Friday morning, Helen called again, her voice tight. They're in the conference room now. And Bob, they've got someone from the board in there with them. I think it's Gregory White. Gregory, the man who'd sat at my dinner table, toasted my retirement, and sworn he'd protect my legacy. If he was in on it, the rot was worse than I thought. I ended the call and sat back in my chair, weighing the new information. If Gregory was involved, this wasn't just embezzlement, it was a coup. They weren't bleeding the company to get rich. They were hollowing it out for a takeover. That night, Victor sent me an encrypted message. Attached was a single photo, Gregory and Clara seated at a private table, in a restaurant laughing with a man I recognized instantly. Paul Kane, a venture capitalist with a history of gutting family companies and selling the scraps. I knew then that Hale Foods wasn't just under attack. It was weeks away from being sold out from under me, the brand stripped, the employees discarded, and my family's name erased from its history. I closed the message and poured myself a glass of bourbon. This wasn't just about saving the company anymore. It was about taking back control before they turned my life's work into a footnote. The next move had to be bold, and it had to be soon. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was panicked, but because my mind was busy mapping the battlefield. Every player, every weakness, every possible outcome spread out in my head like a chessboard. The next morning, I called James Carter. We accelerate, I told him. They're moving toward a sale. I want a legal freeze on any major asset transfers until the board reviews the books. That'll rattle the cage, James said. That's the point. The challenge was that a freeze required cause. The invoices from Helen were good, but not enough. We needed an undeniable pattern of fraud and preferably proof of collusion between Gregory, Clara, and Orion. That meant surveillance, not the amateur kind, but the kind that stood up in court. Victor agreed to run point. His method was quiet, almost boring, tracking shipments, photographing deliveries, comparing manifests to invoices. Within a week, he had a series of time-stamped photos showing trucks arriving at our warehouse, unloading half-empty pallets, and leaving with product that never hit our inventory system. It was theft disguised as procurement. Meanwhile, I stayed in plain sight. I showed up at board lunches, smiled through meaningless conversations, and pretended not to notice the subtle digs about modernizing leadership and fresh perspectives. The more they thought I was slipping into irrelevance, the more careless they became. Helen was my eyes on the inside. She told me about a storage unit rented under Orion's name, where overflow shipments were supposedly kept. Victor tailed Clara's husband there one afternoon and came back with photos of him loading high-end kitchen equipment into the back of an unmarked van. Those units weren't overflow. They were a staging point for resale. I started building a timeline. Every transaction, every meeting, every shipment, patterns emerged quickly. Shipments doubled the week before certain private board meetings. Payments to Orion always cleared within 48 hours, bypassing standard approval chains. Gregory's travel schedule lined up perfectly with Orion's largest deposits. By the second week, James was ready. We can push for an injunction, he said, but it'll tip our hand. If you want to catch them mid-act, we have to wait for the next transfer. Waiting was the hardest part. Every day was a gamble. If they moved faster than we expected, we could lose everything. But if we jumped too soon, they'd bury the evidence. Then Helen gave me the opening I needed. They're planning a final consolidation of accounts, she whispered over the phone. Monday morning. Clara said after that, the old man won't even have keys to the building. It was a perfect setup. They'd gather the funds into one place before the sale, probably an account under Orion's control, giving us a single target. But if we were going to act, it had to be while the transfer happened. I met with James and Victor that same night in the back office of an old diner. When they initiate the transfer, James files the injunction. Victor, you track the money in real time. I want screenshots, timestamps, everything. Victor leaned forward. And if they realize what's happening, I sip my coffee. By then, it'll be too late. We agreed on a contingency if the transfer happened before Monday. Helen would text me a single word storm, and we'd move instantly. Friday passed quietly. Too quietly. Saturday morning, I drove out to the lake house under the pretense of a weekend getaway. The less they suspected, the better. On Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Helen. One word lit up the screen. Storm. I stared at it for a moment, then placed a call to James. It's happening now, I said. He didn't waste time with questions. Then we move now. I grabbed my jacket, locked the lake house door, and headed for the car. By the time I hit the main road, I was already picturing their faces when the freeze order hit. What they thought would be their payday was about to become the first domino in their collapse. But I also knew cornered people make dangerous moves, and this storm was just getting started. By the time I reached the city, James had already set things in motion. He'd filed the injunction with the court, citing documented patterns of asset misappropriation, falsified procurement records, and probable collusion. The judge, to my relief, didn't waste time. Within 30 minutes, an emergency freeze order was granted, blocking all major transfers, including the one they were in the middle of executing. Victor was parked 2 blocks from Orion's office laptop, balanced on the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the digital trail. They were halfway through moving $2.8 million when the system locked them out, he said over the phone, his voice almost amused. Now they're scrambling. I wanted them scrambling. Panic breeds mistakes. Inside the boardroom, Gregory was no doubt fuming. He'd always relied on his temper to intimidate people into silence. But anger doesn't unfreeze accounts. And today he'd find out that the rules he'd bent so casually worked both ways. Helen called me from the hallway outside the boardroom. You'd think someone had cut the power. Phones are ringing nonstop. Clara's pacing. Gregory's red as a brick. They just got word from the bank the funds are locked until the court hearing. Good, I said. Stay out of their line of fire. They'll be looking for someone to blame. We weren't done yet. The freeze bought us time, but time only matters if you use it well. James and I met at his office to prepare the next strike, a comprehensive evidence package for the board and the court. Every photo from Victor, every shipment record from Helen, every bank statement, we organized it into a clean timeline, complete with diagrams that even the most finance-illiterate juror could follow. Meanwhile, Victor's real-time monitoring gave us an unexpected gift: emails. Somehow in their panic, Clara's assistant forwarded a full chain between Orion and Gregory to the wrong contact, Helen. In it, they discussed padding invoices, keeping the old man distracted, and even splitting resale profits. It was practically a signed confession. James grinned when he saw it. This isn't just civil, this is criminal. By mid-afternoon, the situation shifted again. Helen sent a text: they've called an emergency meeting. Only board members and senior officers allowed. Perfect. That meant they were going to try to control the narrative before I could. What they didn't know was that James had already sent the evidence package to the entire board, time-stamped and signed for, by courier. The truth was in their inboxes before Gregory even opened his mouth. I arrived at the office just as the meeting began. Clara looked surprised to see me, then annoyed. This is a closed session, Mr. Hale, she said, her voice dripping with manufactured authority. Then I guess you'll have to call security, I replied, stepping inside. But before you do, you should know every member here has a copy of the documents detailing your little side business with Orion. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through. Gregory's face shifted from shock to fury, but the other board members were already flipping through the evidence. You could see the realization hit: if they stood with Gregory, they'd go down with him. This is slander, Gregory barked. No, I said, sliding a printed chain of his own emails across the table. This is your signature. One of the older board members, a man who'd barely spoken in years, cleared his throat. We need an independent audit immediately, effective today. And just like that, the power balance shifted. Gregory wasn't in control anymore. The board was no longer a shield, it was a firing squad, and he was in the crosshairs. But I knew better than to think it was over. Cornered people don't just give up, they bite. If they couldn't win in the boardroom, they'd try in the shadows. Victor called as I left the building. They're meeting at Orion's warehouse tonight. No phones, no paper trail. You want me to follow, don't lose them, I said. If they're planning their next move, I want to hear every word. As I hung up, the air felt heavier. We'd landed a solid hit, but the fight was far from done. The freeze had stopped the bleeding, but now we were heading into the part where people start making reckless, dangerous plays. And if Gregory was willing to steal millions in the open, I could only imagine what he'd try when he thought no one was watching. The warehouse was a steel skeleton on the edge of the industrial district, where the city lights faded into darkness, and the wind carried the smell of oil and rust. From my car parked half a block away, I watched Victor's tail lights blink twice, a prearranged signal that he'd spotted them inside. I slipped in through a side entrance, the hinges groaning in protest. Years of corporate warfare had taught me one thing: information wins battles. Tonight I wasn't here to fight, I was here to listen. Victor was crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, a small shotgun mic plugged into a recorder. Through the gaps in the boards I could see them, Gregory, Clara, and a thin man with a shaved head I didn't recognize. He was dressed too neatly to be warehouse staff. That freeze was a lucky shot, Gregory was saying, his voice echoing off the metal walls. We moved the rest offshore before the hearing, and Hale's little stunt means nothing. Clara was pacing. We can't. The banks are watching every account, even Orion's. The thin man spoke quietly, but his tone was sharp. Then you don't use banks. I've got channels, but I don't work for free. Gregory pulled out a thick envelope. Half now, half when it's done. I exchanged a glance with Victor. This was it, proof they were planning to circumvent a court order. If we could tie this man to prior fraudulent transfers, it would bury them. Then Clara's voice cut through the air. And what about Hale? He's not going to stop. Gregory leaned forward. Leave him to me. By the time the hearing comes, he'll be too busy cleaning up his own mess to bother with us. I didn't like the sound of that. Gregory had connections, people who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. We slipped out before the meeting ended, careful not to be seen. Back in the car, Victor was already transferring the audio files to a secure drive. This isn't just fraud anymore, it's conspiracy. We hand this to James and they won't just lose their seats, they'll lose their freedom. But I couldn't shake Gregory's threat. If he planned to hit back personally, we needed to be ready. The next day, James and I brought the recording to the district attorney's office. The DA listened without interruption, then leaned back in his chair. This is enough to open a criminal case. But if you want the full weight of the law on your side, we'll need corroboration, financial records, witness testimony, something tangible to tie that third man to previous illegal transfers. That's where Helen came in. She'd quietly been digging through Orion's archive shipments and found discrepancies, containers logged as machinery parts but insured for luxury goods. Each record pointed to the same recipient in Belize. We cross-referenced the name with Victor's network. The match was perfect. The thin man was a professional money mover with a history of laundering through front companies. Armed with that, the DA filed for warrants. By evening, the police had seized documents from Orion's offices and frozen a second tier of accounts Gregory thought were invisible. It didn't take long for the panic to reach my ears. Helen texted me. Gregory stormed out. Clara's crying in her office. The board's whispering about removing them before the brand collapses. Exactly what I wanted, but I still kept one eye over my shoulder. Gregory wasn't done. That night, a black SUV idled near my building for 2 hours before disappearing into the dark. A warning maybe, or a test. Victor offered to deal with it, but I shook my head. We're too close to the finish line to start playing their game. Let the law work while we keep the spotlight on them. The following morning, the DA called. We've set the hearing for next week. With the recordings, the shipment records, and Helen's testimony, this is solid. If they try anything before then, it'll only make my case stronger. I hung up and looked out over the city. Gregory thought he could control every variable. But in his arrogance, he'd given me exactly what I needed, a trail I could follow all the way to the end. 1 week. That's all the time left before the pieces fell into place, and Gregory Hale learned what it felt like to have everything taken away in full view of the world. The hearing drew a crowd big enough to clog the marble steps of the courthouse. Reporters with boom mics, shareholders clutching folders, employees in hail polos who'd taken unpaid hours just to watch. I arrived early with James, Victor, and Helen. She looked small inside her blazer, but her chin was set. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to move. Inside, the DA took the first swing. He laid out the spine of the case with a prosecutor's economy, the shell company, the invoices that circled payment back to accounts linked to Clara Mitchell's husband, the offshore recipient in Belize, the warehouse meeting recorded in full. When the audio played, Gregory's voice, promising to handle me and the money man demanding cash, heads in the gallery, tilted the way wheat leans under sudden wind. Clara avoided my eyes. Gregory didn't. He stared at me the way a drowning man stares at a shore he can't reach. James rose next, not to perform, but to anchor. He walked the judge through the chain of custody, the timestamps, the manifests Victor had matched to photos, the escrow reports from the carriers and the emails Helen had received by accident. James made no speeches. He simply removed every escape door and left the room clean. When it was their turn, the defense tried 3 tactics in 5 minutes: deny, minimize, and smear. Gregory's counsel claimed the recording was taken out of context. Clara's said she'd been misled by vendors. Then they pivoted and went after me, bitter former executive power, hungry, manipulating the press. I could have answered, but I didn't have to. The judge did. Counsel, you can argue motive all day, but your client's signatures are not opinions. He lifted one of the exhibits between 2 fingers. They're facts. By noon, the freeze order was extended and expanded. The court appointed an independent forensic auditor. The DA announced that pending indictment, both Clara and Gregory were prohibited from accessing corporate systems. A murmur rippled across the benches. This wasn't the finish line, but it was the cut rope. Outside, cameras flared. Reporters shouted questions about the recording, about Orion, about the future of Hale Foods. I said what I had prepared the night before, and not a syllable more. We will cooperate fully. We will protect the company's employees and customers. Hale Foods will be run with transparency and the values it was founded on. That's all. It would have been easy to go home and pour a drink. Instead, James and I drove straight to headquarters for the afternoon board session. If there's one rule of corporate war, it's this: press wins headlines. Boards move power. The conference room was colder than I remembered. A tray of untouched sandwiches sat near the credenza, like a joke no one wanted to laugh at. The directors filed in with the alert fatigue of people who'd slept with their phones face up. Emily was already seated at the far end, a glass of water in front of her, both hands flat on the table. The makeup that usually made her look invincible made her look brittle. We began with the auditor's mandate in the court's order. Then I slid a short deck across the table and spoke for exactly 6 minutes. Not about betrayal, about the next 90 days, vendor rebids compliance, sweeps a pause on discretionary capital, outlays a pilot SKU consolidation to free cash without layoffs, and a draft letter to customers acknowledging the turbulence and recommitting to quality. I presented the risk register. I presented the milestones. I presented the out. When I finished, no one spoke for a beat. Then the oldest director, the same man who had called for an independent audit days earlier, cleared his throat. Motioned to appoint Robert Hale interim CEO for a period of 180 days with full authority to execute the recovery plan. Second came from 2 places at once. Emily swallowed, looked down, then up. She surprised me. Before we vote, she said, "I want to say something." Her voice didn't shake. "I made choices I thought would make me look strong. They made the company weak. I won't ask for trust I didn't earn. But I'm not running." She turned toward me. "If the board approves, I'll report to Bob and take whatever assignment he believes serves the company best." It wasn't contrition fashioned for cameras. In the silence after, the room felt closer, as if everyone had exhaled at once. The vote was unanimous. The gavel of private governance is a simple word. It fell around the table like rain. I signed the resolution, slid it back, and looked down the polished expanse to Emily. "You'll lead the EU compliance remediation," I said. "Hard work, thankless, visible to exactly the people who will decide whether we grow again. You'll have a guardrail. Mark Ellison will co-own the milestones. Weekly reports to me, no shortcuts." She nodded, something hard and necessary tightening behind her eyes. We worked until dusk, calls to suppliers, calls to lenders, a town hall scheduled for morning. Victor drafted a sober, unsentimental press note. James coordinated with the DA to keep our statements factual. By the time the city lights came up, the panic that had crackled through the building all week had thinned into effort. You learn after enough battles that relief isn't joy. It's permission to work. On my way out, I paused in the lobby, where the old black and white photo of our first farm stand still hung slightly crooked. I straightened it out of reflex. A shadow moved in the glass. Emily had followed me down. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I'm not offering it," I answered and watched her flinch. Then I added, "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you build. Brick by brick. Show up on Monday. Bring boots." A half smile. "Boots. You'll be in the warehouses more than the conference rooms." She nodded. "Understood." Outside, night pooled on the sidewalks. The crowd of cameras had thinned to a few stubborn lights. Before I stepped into the car, my phone buzzed one last message from an unknown number. "We thought you'd fold." I typed back, "Just this once." "You thought wrong." A month later, the auditor's preliminary report confirmed what we already knew. The criminal case moved forward. The stock lifted off the bottom. We'd lost time, money, and a little of the shine that fools mistake for value. What we hadn't lost was the only thing that ever made Hale Foods worth anything: the discipline to do the right thing when no one's cheering. On a cold morning, I stood on the loading dock as the first consolidated shipment rolled out labels. Straight temperatures, log paperwork clean. Helen handed me a clipboard. Victor, off to the side, raised a hand in a small salute. James texted me a single period, his idea of confetti. I breathed in diesel and winter air, and the particular hopeful noise of a place running the way it's supposed to. Justice, I've learned, is rarely triumphant. It's quieter than that. It sounds like a truck door ceiling. It looks like people keeping their jobs. It feels like a company coming back to itself. The board would pick a permanent CEO in the spring. Maybe it would be me. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, the lesson was written into the steel of the dock, and the ink of the bill of lading: power you steal is brittle. Power you earn especially back is the only kind that lasts.